You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
Samuel Morse was on a ship coming back from Europe in 1832. He had been a portrait and a historical painter. Painting never made him that rich. He traveled to Europe for 3 years to study the old masters. On his voyage back to the U.S., on this ship, Morse happens to meet Charles Thomas Jackson, an American who had been studying in Europe, and he knew about recent experiments in electromagnetism. Jackson described how electricity could be sent along a wire, and if that wire was long, the electricity could still be detected at a distance. Now, as the Atlantic tosses the ship homeward, Morse has very little to do. So he's thinking more and more about magnets and more about electricity and mixing them together. Could the electronic pulse plus the magnet get this key to strike? That was known. Send a signal that could make a key strike. Like a piano key. Wait, if I could do that, here I am on the ocean. What if it's a really long wire? Let me just think through this. I could get that pulse. It would need some voltage and some amperage. But I could send a signal far away. And what if that signal could be something more? He's got the whole system worked out. The electric pulses would lead to key strikes, and there'd be a way of turning that into sending messages if they were coded. Orange lamplight blooms at the center of the campus, rendered in broad but precise strokes. The chandelier in the center flares like a suspended star. From it, thin veils of gold wash outward, touching the rows of desks. Yes, this is a painting of the United States House of Representatives. But its painter, Samuel Morse, has made it appear majestic and has made a painting that could compare with every classical renown painting out there. Glinting off dark coats, sinking into the polished wood, is this lamplight. He's layered the light with careful gradations, thicker, darker dabs at the heart, thinning and softening as they reach the furthest corners. The viewer feels both the immediacy of the flame and the vastness of the shadow in this chamber. And you see the figures in the center, and right in the center there's one raising his arm in great democratic oratory. Across the upper half, the dome of the Capitol is constructed with strokes of pale ochre and blue-gray, each coffer picked out with subtle highlights. The brushwork here is less dramatic, almost architectural in its precision. But below, the crimson draperies are anything but still, painted in flowing arcs. This is where Samuel Morse wished to make his fame, in painting. He also paints the great hero of the Revolution, the hero of France and America, the Marquis de Lafayette, and he'll spend months on this painting. But this is not where his name in history will come from. So Morse has a theoretical concept on this ship. But when he actually tries to do things, he finds that the current he's using fades. After a few hundred yards. This is not even a mile. Nothing much to do with here, because this electric signal is weakening with distance, and that's making any kind of long-distance communication seem impossible. And that's when he engages with Leonard Gale. And Leonard Gale is a chemistry professor at the University of the City of New York. This is what NYU is today. And Morse is teaching painting there. He also has a friend there, Joseph Henry, who works with electromagnets. So Gale explains to Morse that there is a solution to this weak current problem. Just insert relay stations into the cable. So the one signal will then activate an electromagnet in that circuit. And for a little bit, the length that you still have strength for, another circuit, then another circuit, then another circuit. Still a big project, but this is a way to do it. Experiments done in what is now NYU work. With Gale's guidance, Morse strings 10 miles of wire around the university. They finally succeed in sending a signal. There is one more piece that's needed. When Morse gives a demonstration of his prototype at the University of the City of New York in 1837, in the audience is Alfred Vail. He's a young man, he's mechanically skilled, he's interested in this kind of thing, and he's coming from a wealthy New Jersey ironworking family. Morse's device is a crude device, the kind of thing you might see in a university with makeshift wires, crude parts. Vail has access to the ironworks in Morristown, New Jersey, that his family owns, and precision metal work could be made. Skilled mechanics could refine this invention. And he builds a sturdier instrument, improves the electromagnets, and engineers a practical registering apparatus that could record what will become Morse code that could record signals onto a paper strip. Vail's also going to help him simplify his code, the code that's not going to be named after Vail. He needs money, and there's only one place in 1838 to get money like that. That's right, the U.S. Congress. If you float me, he tells some congressmen, I'll build a line from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. A telegraph line that can transmit signals. A representative from Maryland, Kennedy, is hooked. John Pendleton Kennedy, this congressman, is more than just a person who got himself elected to Congress. He has some fame of his own as a novelist. He was born to a Baltimore family, prosperous merchant family, trains as a lawyer, but he has other interests, literature, politics, reform. He's part of Maryland's Whig circle. He's tied to Henry Clay's program of nationalism and economic development. And he'll serve several terms in Congress, and he will be, briefly, Secretary of the Navy under President Millard Fillmore. In 1835, he publishes a book called Horseshoe Robinson, a story of the American Revolution, and it becomes a bestseller. The title character, a blacksmith named Horseshoe Robinson, is cunning and courageous, a frontier everyman who represents patriotic resilience. But like Morse, who wasn't finding success as a painter, Kennedy's not finding success in his second or third novel. How much, he says, you think you need? $30,000, Morse says. Kennedy's at first shocked by this total. It's a lot of money in 1838. I haven't done that calculation, but it's many, many millions of dollars in today's dollars. It does get a hearing in the House, February 23rd, 1843. They start discussing it. Do we want to fund this new electromagnetic line from Washington to Baltimore? Who opposes it? Well, a congressman named Andy Johnson of Tennessee gets up. Wow, we've done so much to encourage science. I think the science of mesmerism should not be ignored either. It's referring to hypnotism and other things. Mr. Houston crisis and says, Millerism, that should be included in the bill too. Millerism is a belief that dramatic, divinely ordained transformation of the world is imminent, tied to the idea of a literal 1,000-year reign of peace and righteousness mentioned in the book of Revelation. And Andy Johnson goes as far to propose an amendment to Kennedy's bill supporting this electromagnetism. Another congressman rises, and in Andy Johnson's suggestion to include mesmerism in the bill and have half of the money go to mesmerism being studied, he says, I'll pay for mesmerism if Congressman Johnson is the subject. When Andrew Johnson enters the House, which it's this year that he enters, 1843, he's entering Tennessee's 1st district. That was a Whig area. But he's a Democrat, so he's got something to prove. He defeated his opponent by outworking him, by outspeeching him. But his speeches weren't like Henry Clay type oratory or anything like that. He was no Daniel Webster. He's blunt, plain-spoken, made a habit of it, and liked to denounce the Congress that he was serving in, particularly their habit of spending. To emphasize this, he dresses in simple clothes. It's easy for Andrew Johnson to do this because he was a tailor. And he would make it so anyone who served in that Congress knew that Andrew Johnson was a tailor. He would comment again and again that he had been a tailor, that he'd worked at the tailor's bench, and that he wore his own tailored clothes. I know how to measure cloth, he would say, and I know when I'm being cheated. One of his favorite targets was congressional perks and spending, and particularly legal fees. He found that Congress spent too much of the public money enriching lawyers in Washington, D.C. through endless litigation, especially when it came to federal land claims, when it came to indemnities, when it came to government contracts. He would rail against the lawyers' lobby, as he saw it, the aristocracy of lawyers. As a tailor, when so many of his fellow members were lawyers themselves, he could do this. He felt, or hinted, that the lawyers' lobby were so in the system that even the ones suing Congress could have been in cahoots with the ones defending Congress. Everybody was getting some legal work, stretching things out, and paying legal fees. He pushed for tighter rules around claims and more accountability in how the government hires outside counsel. His suspicion of federal spending extended beyond the courtroom. He often opposed lavish spending on internal improvements, railroads, canals, bridges. He felt they lined the pockets of contractors and speculators. Yet he's not against all spending, particularly when the government was spending something other than cash, namely land. For instance, he believed strongly in homesteading. He believed that if the government should be granting public land to settlers if they're willing to work it. So we want to say that it proved to be wrong for Andrew Johnson to oppose the Telegraph, to consider it a novelty that would amount to nothing. But he wasn't wrong to oppose all spending. Some of it was very much wasted or enriching insiders. And one positive, or largely most people would see it as positive about his career, is his support of homesteading public lands for people. I mean, I always point this out, a little bit of a digression in an episode that's principally about the Telegraph. But you have to salute those who supported the homesteading concept because it could have gone the other way. What do I mean by that? It could have gone where America could have been like big parts of New York State at the beginning of the Republic, where there's a single or a couple of landholders and you have to pay them big rents to get property. Instead, the West was settled in a different way by people who could get the land and then promise to work it very different concept, but one that did involve granting something from the federal government. And there, Andrew Johnson's all for it. Now, members go to the speaker and say, this mesmerism objection that Andy Johnson and others have is not a serious one. It is not a bona fide amendment. Congressman Mason gets up and says this. It's not a real amendment. It's intended only to injure the character of the House. That goes to the Speaker. The Speaker rules that it should still be voted on. Congress cannot assess the scientific validity of something on their own. It would require scientific analysis for that, and that's not part of this vote. So we have to vote on it. And so they do, and Andy Johnson's amendment is defeated in the House. Now it goes to the House floor, and they actually pass the grant to Samuel Morse to develop electromagnetism. It's 89 to 83. It's laser close. And like a lot of things, probably a few of those votes were spendy congressmen who all they had to say is, I can vote yes for this, because the Senate, that bastion of thriftiness, they're not going to allow this expense. Morse sits in the Senate chamber listening to the next body debate. Many senators are knocking his idea and knocking the idea of spending. And it goes to 11 o'clock at night, and in frustration, Morse just goes home to the residence he's staying at. And the next morning, a messenger comes. It appears at midnight, critically at midnight during the session, when legislative magic happens, along with a lot of other bills. Morse's grant is passed. The $30,000 is allotted, and President Tyler signs it. Morse produces experiments. In a few months, it works, just like he thought out on the ship. The first words put through the telegraph are, that line from Washington to Baltimore are, "What hath God wrought?" Until 1834, the mayor of New York City was not a position that was chosen by the people that live in that city, but it was a position appointed by the Common Council. That system kept the power in the hands of a few people, aldermen, ward leaders. Presumably, the people of the city of New York were electing those people who would elect the mayor, so you could say there was some popular vote. But this wasn't too popular, especially as you're getting into the 1830s. And in 34, a new charter extended democracy into the city's government provides that the mayor will be elected by a popular vote, straight up. Person with the most votes wins the election. And the first contest under this reform immediately, as you can imagine, was bitter, especially between the parties and the party organizations. You already had at this time Tammany Hall, which is an organization that the sachem of Tammany Hall that you can trace back to Burr and his organization. Tammany Hall puts up Congressman Cornelius Van Wyck Lawrence. Deep roots. That family, the Van Wyck family, Lawrence family, deep roots in New York City. The Whigs nominate Gillian Verplanck, who's a writer and a reformer. It's a chaotic campaign. There are crowds in the streets. There's riots at times. There's accusations of fraud. The votes are challenged. When the dust clears, Lawrence wins the election by just a few hundred votes. And he's the first mayor of New York City. Now, he wins election again in 1835 by a stronger margin. On the frigid night of December 16, 1835, fire broke out in a dry goods store near Hanover Square in Lower Manhattan. Gale force winds spread the flames across warehouses filled with cotton, with turpentine, and other combustibles. It's a disaster. It spreads quickly through wooden buildings. Fire companies rush in. But the city has no adequate water system. Pumps froze in the bitter cold. Cisterns ran dry. And in desperation, crews resorted to blowing up buildings with gunpowder to create breaks in the fire. This is how bad it's raging in this key business area. By the time it's under control, more than 600 buildings, over 17 city blocks, have been lost. This is $20 million at that time. You hear a lot about the Great Chicago Fire. If you're on my Patreon, there's an episode about it. This New York fire, I guess, because it's, 50 years before that or so, you don't hear as much about. Mayor Lawrence, at that point of the fire, is only months into his second term. He coordinates with merchants, with city officials, firefighters. It's a panic city, and they look at Lawrence and saying, well, in this disaster, he's doing a pretty good job. Immediate relief was carried out by volunteer companies, private associations. He has a clear case now to improve the city's infrastructure. And he throws his mayoralty behind proposals for a new water system and a Croton Aqueduct project, which would bring fresh water in from Westchester County into Manhattan. When the 1836 election comes, there's a new figure joining the race, Samuel B. Morse, then known not as an inventor, but as a painter and a pamphleteer. And he had recently written a pamphlet, Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States, and he warned of Catholic plots and foreign domination. He formed the Native American Democratic Association. Their opponents called them know-nothings, because if they were asked about their organization, they would simply say, I don't know anything about it. It's the first political party in New York devoted to restricting immigration. This is a city that has many, many immigrants coming. Even at this time, they'll get more in the 1840s. Morse thunders against foreign influence, the supposed power of Rome, but he doesn't have Tammany's organizational strength, nor even that of the Whigs. He collects only about 1,500 votes. He's barely even charting. Tammany is not permanent in winning this election. In 1837, when there's a panic, the Whigs have their chance. And they nominate Aaron Clark and defeat Tammany's nominee, and the first Whig mayor of New York City is elected. Morse leaves politics behind for the most part after 2 defeats, because he'll run again in 1838. And he gets even less votes that time. And that's when he starts building his Telegraph that we talked about. Now, I want to talk a bit about his politics because they change, but they don't change. In fact, you could say that here's this great chance as the know-nothings become a force in the 1850s to have this great inventor of the telegraph, say in the 1856 election when they're running Millard Fillmore as the American candidate. Now, we've talked about Fillmore's actual feelings, what he really thought he was doing in that election. He may have thought he was running more as a Union candidate and was the available vehicle. I get it. There's a whole thing to be said about that. He didn't even officially join a recognized national know-nothing party, and he was away for a lot of the period before the election. Put that aside. Still, Fillmore was running as a know-nothing. Morse does not back him in that election. In fact, stays out of politics, mostly focuses on his lawsuits and his invention. But he does continue to have feelings, particularly about the negative influence of Catholics in America. In an 1854 letter, he refers to Catholicism as a political system disguised as a religion, hostile to the liberties of this country. But he's no longer publishing pamphlets and running as a candidate and things like that. Morse had envisioned the telegraph as a government-run service, like the postal system. Congress, though, was happy to fund it but did not want to operate it. That decision meant that private companies would be the ones to build telegraph lines, and they rapidly built lines crisscrossing the country. Some paid Morse for the use of his patents, and others simply copied the technology and didn't pay him a dime. He spent years defending his patents, often against rivals who were well-funded. They would make money off copying his invention and charging people for it, and then, pay some money to a lawyer to keep fighting that patent battle. He did eventually become wealthy. He toured Europe. Leaders and academies honored him with medals, titles, and banquets. Cities named streets after him. There's a Morse Street in Camden, New Jersey. There's a Moore Street in Washington, D.C. There's a Moore Street in Norwood, Massachusetts. One thing to keep in mind, this is an American invention. This is what James Blaine said. The little thread of wire placed as a timid experiment between the national capital and a neighboring city grew and lengthened and multiplied with almost the rapidity of the electric current that darted along its iron nerves, until within its own lifetime, continent was bound to continent. Hemisphere answered through ocean depths to hemisphere, and an encircled globe flashed forth his eulogy in the unmatched eloquence of grand achievement. 6 years after What Hath God Wrought is sent to Baltimore, the U.S. has 12,000 miles of line. A year later, 75 companies with 21,000 miles of wire is laid. By 4 years later, 30,000 miles of wire are laid. In 1856, regional firms merge into Western Union, which quickly becomes the dominant American network builder. Western Union completes the first transcontinental telegraph, October 24th, 1861, linking the U.S. coasts. They're so excited. You have to understand something about this telegraph. Again, it's an American invention. It's something that shows our pride. That's why there's people naming things Moore Street. It's us over Europe. It's young America's success at a time that we were the grower nation. No invention of modern times has extended its influence so rapidly as that of the electric telegraph. The spread of the telegraph is about as wonderful a thing as the noble invention itself, says Scientific American in 1852. There's already 20,000 miles of telegraph wire laid in the U.S., 2,000 in Britain, about the same in Prussia. Austria has 1,000. There's already treaties between some of these countries to talk to each other. There's a line laid under the English Channel. Telegraph offices do quickly get filled up, particularly in business centers. So you have this very small link between the British Stock Exchange in London and the Central Telegraph Office. It's only 220 yards. But the traffic there is so heavy that they're not getting messages through all the time, and they can't do enough. So if telegraph operators in those times couldn't get a message through, what's going to happen is the paper's just going to pile up in their office, and it's going to be sent later. And then you're defeating the purpose when you could have ran a courier across the way, particularly if it's just that short a distance. So what do? By 1854, they developed the pneumatic tube for this purpose, and capsules of paper messages are simply shot back and forth by compressed air. This bypasses the congested telephone wires. The good system they developed in London spreads to other English cities and to Berlin, Paris, Vienna, eventually New York. It's interesting because what you have in the telegraph, even at this time, is a kind of digital system. It's a representative system of words using two instances, either did or did. Hope I did that right. Did. And that's digital in a sense. And now you have a system that's analog, which is used to bypass the digital because it wasn't perfect enough yet. So interesting development. By the time you get to the Mexican War, that's the first war that occurs in the United States after the invention of the telegraph. And it's not in use well enough yet for, say, like Polk to send instructions to Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott and things like that. In fact, I bet he wish he could, because some of the people that he sends do defy his instructions in various ways, using the length of time of communications as an excuse. By the time you get to the Civil War, so you're really only talking about like 14 years later, Lincoln is very much able to telegraph instructions to his generals, who were pretty close, to be fair, but he's able to telegraph instructions directly to McClellan or Hooker or Burnside or Grant. Whether that's better or not is something that Civil War historians and Lincoln aficionados can endlessly debate. I won't hear. What you did have in the time of the Mexican War, however, is the ability to at least get messages pretty quickly to, say, from Washington, D.C. to that line in Baltimore, and then there were ancillary lines at that time going to Philadelphia and other places, and from there you could get a courier and go to all the other cities. And so you're still increasing the speed of the time that word can get out to the proper places and to where most of the ships are that can send messages by that medium. And so the 1846, you see the forming of the Associated Press in order to pool news, and a lot of that news is coming from the Telegraph, and rather than having, 17 different papers, let's just pool this, and we'll all collect the news that comes off this line. In 1858, there is a line drawn between Ireland and Newfoundland, and the first transatlantic telegraph message goes from Queen Victoria to President James Buchanan, congratulating the two nations on a new era of friendship. Newspapers called it the instantaneous highway of thought between the old and new worlds. There's public parades in New York, bonfires, cannon salutes. But the official electrician had designed the system poorly. He used high-voltage methods that damaged the delicate cable. Within weeks, the signal, it starts to fade. And then, less than a month after the opening, the line goes dead. Cyrus Field, who had created it, is humiliated. He had been a wealthy New York paper merchant and made so much money in business he had retired early. He retired at age 33 and was just doing inventions and investments. Field refuses to quit, though, and 8 years later in 1866, using improved cable and the expertise of William Thomson, who we know as Lord Kelvin, the Atlantic cable was laid successfully, and the dream is finally realized. William Thomson we know in history, maybe we know, as Lord Kelvin, and he's famous for that temperature system that has an absolute zero. But he's also a telegraph pioneer. The telegraph, as we're to discuss, is, linked to people in the high tech of the 19th century. He had designed something called a mirror galvanometer, which could detect faint telegraph currents over thousands of miles of cable. It's critical because when this starts failing, earlier electricians had blasted the line with too much voltage, and that's what destroys it. So we've got to get that down to a science. And he does with his invention. The telegraph quickly proves itself in a true crime story of this time. In 1845 in England, John Towell murders his mistress and attempts to flee by train from the city of Slough to London. The police had no time to chase him by horseback, but this new device, the electric telegraph, was available at the local station. Towell's description was sent ahead, and officers were waiting for him when the train arrived. It was one of the first times in history that a criminal was caught by means of instant communication. Now, it's interesting, there's an international angle to this whole thing, because we're thinking about a story where we're connecting Britain to Canada, and you can get a message from there to America. But they needed a product called gutta percha. This is a rubbery material derived from the sap of certain tropical trees that are in Malaysia and Indonesia. It's tough, and when it's warm, it's flexible, and it's an excellent electrical insulator. It completely resists water, but unlike tapping a rubber tree, which could be done repeatedly, the 19th century gutta percha trade was often destructive. Harvesters would cut the tree down and strip it to collect the sap. Whereas with a rubber tree, you're tapping in and you can get it repeatedly. Well, the 1870s observers are already warning that gutta percha trees were being devastated. Forests in Singapore, the Malay Peninsula are heavily stripped. Some species were driven close to local extinction. The indiscriminate felling of these trees meant that whole strands vanished, altering the forest structure and depriving wildlife of canopy cover and fruiting trees. Here's John Tully. By 1900, at least 1 million gutta percha trees had been cut down on Dutch Borneo, and possibly as many as 26 million. The telegraph remains essential really through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Then it's yielding to telegraph, telephones, radio, and digital networks. In fact, Western Union doesn't end telegram service until 2006. Morse will receive honors from European monarchs. The Sultan of Turkey, the Emperor of Austria give him awards. In 1856, he gets another congressional appropriation, this one directly to him, and not for the purpose of doing something, but as payment to him, $80,000 as a retrospective prize for the invention he made. He continues to tinker with improvements in telegraphy. He actually is trying to get involved in photography as well. He invests in real estate. He abandons politics, but not public life. He's no longer remembered for his speeches. In 1845, he joins with Amos Kendall, the former Postmaster General, to form the Magnetic Telegraph Company, extending a line from Baltimore to Philadelphia and eventually New York. By 1846, you have New York linked up to Washington, also to Boston, also to Buffalo. Morse buys an estate overlooking the Hudson at Poughkeepsie, settles into his new role as an inventor and a public figure. He secures royalties after the Supreme Court upheld his patent in 1854. He gives away a lot of his fortune. His health starts to decline in 1870. In 1871, a huge public celebration in Central Park honors him. Western Union and the city host the event, and messages of tribute are sent over the telegraph wires from around the world. He taps out a brief farewell message to the world because it's June 1871, and they think this man may not have long to go. He does live until almost another year, April 2nd, 1872. Morse dies in New York City at age 80. He's buried in Greenwood Cemetery. One thing I want you to keep in mind about that telegraph is that it lives beyond Morse and associates America with high tech. We've talked, especially in the Arc of Commerce series, I've talked about leaders that were telegraph operators. Carnegie was one. He was a telegraph operator at first. What's another one? Richard Sears, the founder of Sears and Roebuck, was a telegraph operator at first. Edison, telegraph operator. I'm going to add in here a little bit from the U.S. Army around the time of World War II, which gives you a little bit of how Morse code works.
Rhythm is indeed the key to good sending. If your code is to mean anything to others in the radio net, then you've got to send rhythmically. Dits must be uniform and short. Das, uniform and long. Spacing exactly right. Very small, tight spaces between the dits and das in a character.
I wanted to note that he uses the term radio net, and this is the 1940s during World War II. It's kind of interesting, right, to hear the term net. And a radio net was a scheduled, coordinated group of stations exchanging traffic. And the internet is very similar. It's a continuous packet switch network. So these terms are related. I'll explain briefly how. He's referring to the radio nets. So by the time this gentleman is explaining how to properly use the code named after Samuel Morse, you'll note we're no longer talking about wires. This is now radio waves sending out the Morse code. And simply a net is short for a network. So radio men had used this term long before the internet. Army Signal Corps manuals, amateur traffic handlers, merchant ship operators all use this phrase, the radio net. And the small word net carries forward. So in the early 60s and 70s, the computer scientist working on mainframes borrow the same terminology. And so ARPA makes ARPANET. And when ARPANET in the 1980s joins with other experimental networks, engineers coined the phrase the internetwork for the broader system, and that's shortened to Internet. So yeah, what he's saying is directly, related to the Internet we know today.
As the operator will now demonstrate, with letters that are all dits or all das. Each of them has a distinctive beat. There's the galloping sound. Hotel. No, it's not H. Think phonetically. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and so on. This is hotel. 4 dits. Galloping like a horse in a hurry. Did-it-a-dit, did-it-a-dit. Why the hurry? To get to the hotel. Now the sound of the 3-beat letters. Oscar and Sierra.
The U.S. Navy stops using Morse code in July 12th, 1999, and the last message, Nave Marco Cellcom decommissioned. Goodbye, was sent over the telegraph lines. The Coast Guard had done that in 1995. The U.S. Army stopped requiring knowledge of Morse code for soldiers in the 1970s. Some use persisted into the 1980s. And this is a little bit from the Arc of Commerce series. We talked about Edison. Now that you've heard the soldier telling you how you're supposed to do it right, you can hear Edison and what happened to him when he was a telegraph operator.
Telegraph operator in some ways was the center of the universe. And as Edison said, the newspapers that he would telegraph for allowed him to come in after the press at 3 a.m. and get all of the exchanges that I wanted. I never slept more than a few hours. I was thus kept posted and knew every member of Congress and all of the topical doings, as well as the prices of breadstuffs in all the markets. His reading was not incidental, but was important because in the days of rotting wires in the 1860s, as much as a fifth of a message would be lost in transmitting between the keys, and Edison would have to fill in some details. Sometimes he'd get things wrong. Edison's telegraph job provided him with knowledge, a paycheck, and also a fraternity, a kind of club of telegraph operators throughout the country that he could rely on. It was not long before he got a job at the Franklin Telegraph Company in Boston, and he tells the story. The weather being cold and being clothed poorly, my peculiar appearance caused much mirth. And as I afterward learned, the night operators had conspired together to put up a job on the guy from the Woolly West. I waited an hour, and they asked me to a table to take a special report from the Boston Herald. They arranged to have one of the New York operators, a fast sender, to put me through the ringer, slowly increase the speed of the keys and the transmission, as Edison relayed his message. Then it got faster, then absurdly fast. But I easily adopted my pace, Edison said, and he noticed the other operators were all watching him around the table now. They planned to laugh at him, but now they were amazed as he was taking every letter down. I knew then they were putting a job on me, but I kept my own control. And then, instead of going fast, the New York operator began to slur, running telegraph signals together and sticking the keys so that the words were hard to determine. I was not the least bit discomforted, Edison said. In fact, he counter-jabbed on the other line and sent a telegraph message. "Say, young man, send with your other foot," which made the other operator laugh. Someone else had to take over.
Here's what I like about our sponsor, All the Hacks Podcast. You hear all these business podcasts, and they're all telling you to do things. Start a business, buy a home, write this off, write that off. All the Hacks is a podcast that acknowledges that things are kind of expensive right now. So All the Hacks focuses on tips and tactics to upgrade your life, your money, your travel, while spending less. It's about hacks, money. There's an episode about what each generation gets right and wrong with Ben Carlson. No relation. Some of us in Gen Z or boomers can learn from millennials and Gen Z. It doesn't just go one way. I like his bonus episode about earning points on your mortgage or cards that have up to 4% bonus programs. All great. Search for All the Hacks. That's All the Hacks in your podcast app. Hit follow and start upgrading your life today.